Okay, so I think the numbers have started to slow down a bit, so I'll just go ahead and get us started. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from, and thank you for joining today's installment of the Wednesday webinar series. My name is Kayla Pendergast, and I'll be one of your hosts today along with my colleagues from HUD. I'm going to kick us off with a few housekeeping items before I pass it over and really dive into the content today. First, our panelists will share their knowledge with us for the beginning part of the presentation, and we will reserve all remaining time for any questions. There are two ways you can ask questions. First, in the right-hand navigation panel, you'll see a hand-shaped icon. If you want to ask your question out loud, if there's a lot of context or a lot of sort of background that you need to provide, it's sometimes helpful to ask it out loud. So if you would like to do that, just raise the hand-shaped icon like you'll see I just did, and we'll get you unmuted and you can ask your question out loud. The second way that you can ask a question is to just type it in the chat. This is also in the right-hand navigation panel. You'll see the chat box, and you can just go ahead and send your question there, and I will read it out loud in the order received. Everyone is muted upon entry, as I'm sure you've noticed. If you're having any technical difficulties, send us a message in the chat, and we'll do everything we can to help you figure it out. Today's session is being recorded and will be available on HUD Exchange, usually 1 to 2 weeks after the session. And then immediately following the webinar, you'll receive sort of a pop-up in your browser with a survey to complete on today's webinar, and we ask that you please take a moment to do this. We really do look at that feedback and take it into consideration as we're selecting topics for future webinars. So I think that's all from my end, and I can pass it over to Jane to get us started.
Thank you, Kayla, and I want to welcome everybody this afternoon, I guess. This afternoon. So our topic for today is what happens when a disaster does strike, what does the Housing Authority need to do, and what tools are available to the Housing Authorities in those events. So this is one of a series of Wednesday webinars that we've been doing. As you can see, we've done RAD Section 18, the new blend options, preservation strategies, environmental review procedures, the developer role for repositioning public housing choice neighborhoods, homeownership programs. We are hoping later this year to do another one on fair cost to RAD, and we have a few other ideas. But if you have requests for what we do on these, please send a note in the chat or so we can follow up on that. So as I mentioned, we're talking about, it's an overview of what to do when the public housing units are suddenly damaged due to a natural disaster, casualty loss, or any other emergency. And we're looking at strategies to help the PHA make informed decisions about whether to restore or reposition damaged public housing units with the consideration to insurance proceeds and other available funding, the condition of the property, and the PHA's repositioning goals. Our presenters today, myself, Kathy Sebas from the SAC is also going to be here. Tony Landecker is the director of our Little Rock office, but he's been helping out a lot, particularly in the Gulf Coast. I'm not sure that Chris Granger, but we're hoping somebody from the CAP Fund will join us to talk about the Emergency CAP Fund program. We have Antonio Cardova, who's the director of our Caribbean office. Obviously, we've seen a lot of natural disasters down there, so he's doing really well. And Brian Schlossnagel, who is an engineer in one of the field offices, and he runs our he organizes the emergency response team throughout HUD when for the housing authorities whenever those come up. So at that point, Tony, are you on?
Yes, I am.
Okay, you want to go ahead?
Yep, I just need the next slide. All right, so the first thing we want to talk about, first and foremost, is always ensuring resident safety. I think even before resident safety, ensuring your staff and your own safety when you're there with the housing authority or your mixed finance property or your RAD property, multifamily units. So the first thing you're going to look at is, are the units habitable? Can these units be sustainable for families to live in? Is the damage just of an external nature, or is there water intrusion? Is there mold? If the units are habitable, then assess what damage needs fixing. You know, could it be an emergency temporary roofing that could make them habitable? Maybe an emergency window replacement, something like that. I've actually seen pictures like this or housing like this. And so obviously this unit here with the direct external exposure to the elements would not be a habitable unit. Last bullet there, if units are not habitable, initiate emergency transfer relocation. That's going to go into that a little bit more in the next slide. So emergency relocations. If you find that your units are uninhabitable, maybe you have a situation where your property has flooded and the units are sustaining 3 or 4 feet of flooding water. Obviously, we can't have the families living in those units. If you cannot make necessary repairs within a reasonable time, you must provide alternative housing. Will relocation be temporary or permanent? That's something that you need to decide upon yourselves with the contractor, with your insurance agent. You know, how long is that relocation going to be? There's a larger context along the lines of rehabilitation or, you know, taking the project down, and that's going to be discussed later on in the slides. Either way, if it's going to be more than 12 months, you need to work with Uniform Relocation Assistance and Real Property Acquisition Act. That will apply. HUD has relocation specialists that can assist in that endeavor. First and foremost, we want to make sure that you're keeping track of your families until permanently relocated or moved back to public housing units. There's too many examples and too many times we see that the families, if it's a presidentially declared disaster, end up in the FEMA temporary housing program or the hotel program, and the PHA is not keeping track of those families. And so it's of utmost importance, not just for, you know, your PIC data, for the unit status data, to make sure that we know where these families are, not so much for a financial solvency, but for the fact that the family's safety and that they're trackable and that the PHA is taking care of their families. And just like I just mentioned, don't put families in end of participation status and PIC until permanently relocated. A couple different reasons why that matters. First, we don't want your EOP rate to reflect that. Number 2 is you should be getting subsidy, whether that's in a natural disaster setting or taken offline for modification, modernization setting, until that family is permanently relocated back in there. We don't want the housing authority suffering, you know, vacancy data or vacancy lags in your funding with your subsidy or with your FAS score with your occupancy rate. So that's one reason why you don't want to put them in an EOP status. Next slide. So housing options, emergency relocation, public housing units. If you have some vacant units, maybe you have a different AMP that did not sustain damage. Is HUD approval required to do that? No. You're not going to receive funds for that. You're already receiving funds for those units in general. Hotel accommodations. You can use your capital funds. You've always been able to use your capital funds for that existing funds or non-1937 funds. You do need HUD approval if that's an emergency grant. So that would be a HUD emergency grant outside of a presidentially declared area. If you were awarded an emergency grant through the capital fund program, there is an approval process for relocation that takes place. Touched on the FEMA units. So HUD approval, is that required? No. Normally FEMA has their own application process that takes place. If that family can prove that they've been taken out of their unit, then they are able to qualify for the FEMA temporary hotel assistance. Housing choice voucher. So if you're a dual agency or there's an agency like maybe a county program or a parish program that's operating within or around that city, They can offer a voucher to those participants. Normally, they need to have a preference in place in the admin plan, either disaster preference or, if you're a combo agency, a preference for your displaced public housing families that'll allow them to, per se, jump the waiting list and be issued a voucher. And this is going to get touched on later on in the presentation, but emergency tenant protection vouchers, yes, HUD approval is required, must submit Section 18 application and evidence imminent health and safety. So this would be an example of maybe your building becomes non-structurally sound. Maybe the building has sustained such large amounts of electrical or flooding damage that it will not be repairable. This would be an example where you're going to request from the SAC an emergency Section 18 application, and emergency tenant protection vouchers may be issued for those families. Project-based voucher PVV RAD units. This could be a combination agency. This could be an agency that hasn't done a complete RAD conversion and still has public housing units. It could be Section 8 units or Section 8 participants that could move into a PVV RAD unit. Similar to the HCV program, you're going to need, you will not need HUD approval, but you'll need some kind of preference on your waiting list to accommodate those families and why they are jumping, your normal waiting list preferences. And I believe that's all I have on my slides.
Thank you, Tony. So my name is Antonio Cordova. As Dane explained, I'm the director for the Caribbean office. And the next few slides, we're going to talk a little bit about, and after, we helped with the process of relocation of all these families and temporary housing. So what do we do? And how do we deal with the actual physical condition of the properties? And what are the resources available to that effect? As always, when we engage in this type of webinars and guidance, remember to contact your field office, right? There's your relationships with us, direct point of contact with us, and we have a structure to provide support within the Office of Field Operations of PIH that it's called the Emergency Response Team. So we have support and created this group of people, and many of us who are speaking today are part of that group to support the field office as we go through the providing TA to you. Public housing agencies and others regarding disaster. So can the property be restored as public housing? So as you all know, the ACC requires that units damaged be promptly restored or rebuilt unless written approval by HUD. EHS, EHS, Emergency Health and Safety, and so on, and others, debris removal. We're going to talk a little bit further about what kind of funding may be available through the different phases. Also important as we go along, what are, the market conditions, what are the damages, doing the physical need assessment, and so on, to be able to figure out what this development proposal may look like, the 5-year plan, all the same things that we have in our toolbox to doing rehab or reconstruction or repositioning of public housing will come into play, right? There will be, and again, the field office is your point of contact to work through all this. And we're going to talk a little bit further on the funding for debris removal, restoration, and rebuilding. Next slide, please. So, is the property in a safe condition? Safety hazards to the community. As I mentioned before, emergency health and safety issues need to be addressed immediately upon, as soon as possible. after the safety conditions allow for addressing, right? When we're talking about a major disaster, even if it's non-presidentially declared, the safety of you and your team always comes first. And so you may take action without otherwise requiring HUD approval by only to the extent necessary to maintain the property in a safe condition, right? Eliminate hazard, emergency health and safety. Again, talk to your field office, keep in contact with them for any other requirements, such as environmental reviews, including how to address imminent health and safety risk, and the activities necessary to control or arrest the effect of the disaster or imminent threat to public safety. More information on the link that's provided regarding this topic. Next slide, please. So, as you move along through the process of determining what are the options that you're going to have with regarding to, rehabilitation, repositioning, demo dispo, reconstruction, here we're listing what are the funding that may be available to you depending on the type of disaster, right? So if we're, as the ACC requires, there's an insurance requirement for housing authorities, regardless if it's presidentially or non-presidentially declared disaster. When we're talking about a presidentially declared disaster, or as FEMA nomenclature, major disaster declaration by the president, then the PHA will have access to FEMA funding through their public assistance grant, their hazard mitigation. Upon Congress appropriation, there will be TPVs funding available. And then for non-presidentially declared disasters, and we will talk further down in this presentation about what are the options for PHAs about the emergency cap fund for non-presidentially declared disasters. And just like you do for the rehab, reconstruction, we will always encourage that you use one of the mixed finance models that we have in the toolbox, leveraging LIHTC, being RAD or any other PPV transactions, PVRA, or straightforward mixed finance to leverage all this funding. Just for your information, we just closed a RAD deal, PVRA, for the Virgin Islands Housing Authority, and just because it was on the 10th, and we actually leverage from insurance, FEMA public assistance, FEMA hazard mitigation, CDBG-DR, and LIHTC 9%. So again, contact your field office. We have the emergency response team at PIH OFO to provide support to the field office on this process. Next slide. Excuse me. So this is another one that, from experience, we want to make sure that we highlight this fact. Sometimes in the fog of war, quote unquote, when we go into a disaster mode, our partners at FEMA and some of the folks at the local emergency management offices in your location may not be aware, but yes, public housing is actually a priority under the Stafford Act, and we provide the citation of the specific section under the Stafford Act. Stafford Act is the enacting legislation statute for FEMA. So public housing is actually a priority for disaster damage repairs. And again, we provide a link over there for additional information regarding frequently asked questions about public assistance. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, when we're talking about emergency health and safety and then long-term repositioning, rehab, or reconstruction of units, these are the categories under the public assistance that the PHA is going to be eligible. So during the response phase, as also the nomenclature used, we use at HUD as well as FEMA, these are the kind of funds that will be available by FEMA for the PHA. So debris removal, Category A under public assistance, and Category B, emergency protective measures. So this means that you will have this funding available through reimbursement to address this emergency health and safety and doing the cleanup of the site. It is very important. Preparation is key for any disaster. So one of the recommendations that we always provide to PHAs is that you keep the relationships and have contact with your local emergency management office. So that's going to be your point of contact with FEMA, right? So all these process and protocols and procedures on how to request this funding is going to go through that local emergency management entity and coordination with FEMA. We will, again, the field office will be there to give you TA and guidance when needed, but you need to have those relationships and understand how that works with the local emergency management. So that's the response, right? For the permanent work or the recovery and reconstruction phase of a disaster, Category E under the public assistance is where the amount of money that you're going to be able to request from FEMA will come, and that's what we mentioned about permanent work as well as hazard mitigation. All those are encompassed under the Category B for buildings and equipment, and that's where public housing as a public facility will be eligible for public assistance under FEMA. With that, I'm complete my part of the presentation. Next presenter.
Hello and good afternoon. Sorry, Jane. My name is Brian Stoffogel, and I am pinch hitting for one of our colleagues, Chris Granger here. So Antonio just did a great job wrapping up some of the federal aid that is issued through FEMA when there's a presidentially declared disaster. However, the question arises, what do you do when it is a localized disaster and there is no presidentially declared disaster? What resources do you have at your disposal? So first and foremost, you will always want to utilize your insurance proceeds to cover any damages that you may have encountered from a localized disaster, or really any disaster for that matter. In addition, you can also utilize your capital funds that you already have obtained from HUD to address the emergency or disaster recovery. However, we understand that oftentimes you have already obligated your funds and there may be very little that's available to address that need. In those circumstances, we have an additional pot of money called the Capital Fund Emergency and Natural Disaster Fund, which is specifically set aside each year. This past year was $20 million, and it is specifically for non-presidentially declared disasters. So if a PHA has encountered an emergency or disaster, they can apply for these funds. So there are a couple caveats here that we first need to kind of go over to have a better understanding. First and foremost is the definition of an emergency. So that is an unforeseen or unpreventable event or occurrence that poses an immediate threat to the health and safety of the residents, including fire safety that must be corrected within 1 year of funding or are non-presidentially declared disasters. And so this is, the key word here is unforeseen. So lots of times PHAs have a long backlog of capital needs and repairs, and if you have been neglecting or postponing addressing work, for example, if you have a boiler that has needed repairs over time and you have been pushing back the work because of the cost, and then one day the boiler no longer works, that is not really an eligible cost through the Capital Fund Emergency Natural Disaster Fund because it was a foreseen cost and you knew the life expectancy of that boiler was coming to an end. In addition, it should be an extraordinary event such as an earthquake, flood, or hurricane affecting the public housing property, excluding areas covered by the presidentially declared emergency and major disaster. And the reason for that is to prevent duplication of funding. So Antonio just went over lots of the FEMA resources that are available. And when there is a presidentially declared disaster, that is the pot of money that's available to really address the repairs that are required for public housing, and PHAs will be able to apply for FEMA public assistance. Another important note about this grant, the $20 million is issued on a first-come, first-served basis. So if there are lots of different events at the beginning of the year that absorb the funds, there may be no longer funds available in the later half of the year. So it's very important if you encounter a disaster that's in a non-presidentially declared disaster, that you go ahead and apply as quickly as possible so that way you can ensure your application has been submitted. And to do so, you will first approach your local field office to submit your application. They will then review and make sure it is eligible and concur with your application and submit that for headquarters review to start processing and provide the funds. And if you have any types of questions, it is very important to engage in good dialogue with your local field office so that way you can have a good understanding of the exact resources and documents that you need to submit in order to have a successful application. Next slide, please. So let's go over a couple of the different eligible and ineligible activities to have a good understanding of what can ultimately be approved for the Capital Fund Emergency and Natural Disaster Fund. So first and foremost, eligible activities include activities associated with unforeseen, unpreventable emergency or non-presidentially declared disasters. And typically, those are going to be the activities in budget line item 1480, general capital activities, including construction, architectural and engineering fees, and relocation, the Habitable opportunity to help temporarily rehouse individuals. In addition, budget line item 1501, contingencies, can also be used, and that is approved on a case-by-case basis. And eligible activities are also very important to understand so that as you are going through and submitting your paperwork, you have a good idea of what may not be included. So some of the key things that we're looking at is any activity that's not directly required by the conditions of emergency disaster, so it has to be specifically related to the event at hand, and any activity that is not an eligible capital fund expense under 24 CFR 905. In addition, budget line item 1406, operations, including general maintenance, is an ineligible activity. And finally, budget line item 1410, administration activities as well. So as you're going through here, a great resource for you to refer back to where you can get the full 411 of the Capital Fund Emergency Disaster Grant is going to your Capital Fund Guidebook, which was published in 2016, in addition to consult with your local field office. Next slide, please.
So Brian, there's some feedback. There's like some background noise that we're hearing. It's like a whooshing sound. Not sure if maybe you can take a sec to connect on your phone or move to a different room.
Yeah, 1 second, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your patience, everyone. We just want to make sure that everybody can hear okay.
Hello, this is Brian. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, that sounds really good. That sounds much better.
Okay, let me get back to the slides here. Sorry about that, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
As we dive into our HUD approvals and restoration and rebuild. So Antonio did a great job of explaining lots of different funding proceeds and diving a little bit into some of the options for restoration and rebuild. So at this juncture, we're really at the crossroads to decide if we should restore or rebuild our damaged public housing. And ultimately, there are two questions that we are going to be asking. First and foremost, what is the condition of our public housing units? Obviously, if damage is completely decimated the project, we're going to have to do some type of rebuilding activity versus if there were minor damages, we may want to go through the restoration process. In addition, the available financial resources to tackle the conditions at hand. And speaking of financial resources, our first and foremost financial resource will always be insurance. I know we've touched a little bit about this before, but if there's one thing that you really gather from this presentation is the importance of insurance. And so going back to our consolidated annual contributions contract or your ACC with HUD, it specifically indicates that outside of reasonable deductible, PHAs are required to have adequate insurance to cover the cost to rebuild or replace damaged or destroyed units. And in addition, PHAs are required to promptly restore, reconstruct, and or repair any damaged or destroyed properties of a project except with written approval of HUD to the contrary. So as you start to look at your insurance, it's not only a good idea to verify that you have insurance, but that you have adequate insurance. Many times as we're going through disaster mitigation and restoring our portfolio, we have found time and time again that PHAs have insurance that doesn't really meet their specific needs to go over that replacement. In addition, with insurance, it is so important that gets re-emphasized in Notice PIH 2016-13. In addition to outlining the requirements there, it does a great job of further outlining the next steps to rebuild, specifically in Section 6, the casualty reporting requirements, where when a project has been damaged by a casualty or emergency disaster, the PHA should immediately proceed to develop a plan for the damaged units. And in developing a plan, the PHA really should consider, again, the extent of the damages. So was it a complete or partial loss to their portfolio or units? And in addition, the funding available for repair or replacement. So this, again, includes our insurance proceeds first and foremost. And then we'll start to dive into, is there existing capital funds that may be available for non-presidentially declared disasters? Are there other capital fund emergency and natural disaster funds that we can tap into? Or for our presidentially declared disasters, are we able to utilize different FEMA funds for CDBG, DR, and state and local funds to start to tackle some of the replacements or rebuilding opportunities? And in addition, it kind of indicates that we should be considering the realities of the local construction market. Oftentimes when we are imposed with a natural disaster, the supply and demand is drastically skewed. so costs start to increase. And also, in addition, as we are recovering from the pandemic, we are seeing increase in labor costs and labor shortages and material costs and so forth. So all these are things that you should be considering as you start to think about reconstruction. Furthermore, a couple other things that are included that we often don't think about when it comes to reconstruction is also whether there were damages that included UFAS accessible units. So of which the loss could affect the PHA's compliance with physical accessibility requirements. And as we start to think of rebuilding or restoration, we want to ensure that we're replacing those adequately. And then finally, we need to outline the PHA's future plans for the project if the PHA is planning to demolish or dispose or converting the overall project. And this is where it's very pivotal to start to outreach to your local field office. Again, oftentimes field offices will have firsthand experiences from other PHAs that they can share to avoid potential pitfalls. In addition, we want to recognize conventional reconstruction has not been utilized by many PHAs for several years, and there's lots to the process overall that they may be unfamiliar with. And furthermore, depending on the extent of damage, the PHA may need to submit a Section 18 demolition application. And specifically, demolition is defined under 24 CFR 970.5, where it specifically means the removal by razing or other means in whole or in part of one or more permanent buildings of public housing development, or involves any 4 or more of the following activities. And that includes the envelope removal, so that could be roofs, windows, exterior walls, kitchen removal, bathroom removal, electrical system removal, or plumbing system removal. And in addition to that, a PHA may have to submit the development proposal under 24 CFR 905. And it is important to note that development of public housing can be done through either conventional construction of new units, but could also include the acquisition of units as well. And so, for instance, if you had some scattered site properties that were completely demolished and there is available units in your local community, it may be more cost-inducive and faster to go ahead and acquire those properties versus reconstructing on that same parcel. Whichever direction that the PHA wants to go, they'll have to submit a development proposal. And there is 11 specific sections that is included in a development proposal. And that includes the project description, site information, participant description, development project schedule, accessibility, project costs, operating pro forma, local cooperation agreement, environmental review, market analysis, and program income and fees. So that may sound like a lot, and it may be unfamiliar for a lot of PHAs. But again, this is where communication with your local field office will prove to be very advantageous. So that way they can help assist you through that process and make sure that you have a good understanding of each of those different sections as you start to construct your overall development proposal. And at this point, we'll go to our next section of exploring repositioning. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we have been tapping into in recent years is repositioning. And the question that you should be asking yourself is, should I reposition instead of doing reconstruction? And so what are some of the reasons that you may want to do that? So the first and foremost answer with that is typically positive cash flows. So in recent years, we have seen a major reduction from our conventional public housing development and mixed finance developments due to marginal or even negative cash flows in those areas. Repositioning through rental assistance demonstration, or RAD, can often leverage multiple financial resources and allows more financial creativity to produce positive cash flow. So you can either have conventional RAD transactions or RAD Section 18 blends, where you can start to utilize replacement tenant protection vouchers in combination with project-based vouchers. And also, one of the most advantageous aspects of RAD is incorporating low-income housing tax credits, or LIHTC, funding sources. The second aspect that you may be asking yourself if you want to reposition is the location of the site is not appropriate for continued housing use? So historically, public housing has often been constructed on less than desirable land with numerous environmental risks, including being in the floodplain. So it may no longer make sense to develop in that same location because in the forthcoming future, there is a good chance that flooding will reoccur and we will be right back where we were before. In addition, you may have a once viable location has now encountered an environmental change and is no longer viable. So with climate change, we're seeing many different areas along the coast that are experiencing flooding due to storm surges. And also, if there was a previous disaster, you can have things such as rivers completely relocate and redistribute the floodplain. So with that, you may have had a perfectly viable area that is now in an area that is in harm's way and it no longer makes sense to reconstruct in that area. So if the location is not suitable for redevelopment, the Public Housing Authority can reposition through Section 18 and voucher out, or utilize RAD transfer of assistance to find a more suitable area. And then finally, if you were already working on repositioning plans or brainstorming the application for that project, this may be a great opportunity to proceed forth, and it may bump up your timeline for your repositioning activity. And in some cases, the silver lining of a disaster could be additional financial resources to ensure a successful repositioning plan. So with additional insurance, FEMA public assistance, CDBG DR, state or local resources, those can be additional financial resources to really further promote your repositioning activities. Next slide, please. So when it comes to funding your redevelopment or repositioning, the general rule of thumb here is leave no stone unturned. PHAs are highly encouraged to take a look at all different financial resources, and financial creativity is often the difference between a successful and an unsuccessful plan. Antonio has talked a lot about different FEMA funds that are available, but first and foremost, going back once again to our insurance proceeds are pivotal in the reconstruction and go tied hand in hand with what's outlined in the ACC in order to make restoration and rebuilding successful. In addition, there are the capital funds that are also available to help assist for redevelopment as well, all of which should be outlined before a demo disposition under Section 18 or RAD is approved. And in addition, there may be CDBG-DR funds, low-income housing tax credits, and then finally, tenant protection vouchers and project-based voucher cash flow through RAD transactions can prove very incentivizing for repositioning activities. Next slide, please. So at this juncture, we are now ready to submit our repositioning plan and application. So the first step that we encourage PHAs to do is submit a request to the local field office, including your estimate cost to restore, rebuild, and your estimated insurance proceeds and your repositioning plans. This once again offers a great opportunity for the PHA to engage in dialogue with the field office to ensure all I's are dotted and T's are crossed with their application. And in addition, the field office can provide great technical assistance to help guide your PHA through the process and avoid some of the pitfalls when trying to go it alone. From there, the PHA will submit a repositioning application via Section 18 or RAD, and this is where you will utilize IMS PIC, and the PHA will identify the associated units for that application and submit the supplemental documentation for that application. Then next, if submitting a Section 18 application, the PHA must show evidence of obsolescence and conduct a total development cost or TDC test. In the event of a disaster, this can be achieved through either photos or an insurance adjuster claim instead of developing the conventional physical needs assessment or P&A, which contains an itemized list of rehab needs and costs associated and the associated costs. So this will allow PHAs to demonstrate, because through the insurance mechanism, you have a total cost associated with repairs. And then also with the photos, you can typically demonstrate that either the building was completely raised or that 4 of the 5 conditions were met for demolition as well. And this helps ensure the TDC limits are executed and surpassed. For elevator structures, the TDC limit is 62.5%, and all other structures, the limit is set at 57.14%. And finally, if the property is completely destroyed or razed to the ground, the PHA should submit an after-the-fact Section 18 demolition application to IMS-PIC. And hopefully this provides you a good overview of your repositioning and redevelopment options at your disposal. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jane, who will dive into emergency tenant protection vouchers.
Brian, thank you. Thank you for stepping in for Chris as well. We often get phone calls at the SAC about emergency tenant protection vouchers. Oftentimes in a disaster, when a housing authority has displaced families, they're like, can we get the vouchers to move them out? We do approve emergency vouchers. That being said, I want to make sure that if you do apply for them, if you are interested in getting them, you need to show that you plan to reposition under Section 18. If you think you want to reposition under RAD, don't ask for vouchers. If you think you're going to renovate the building and keep it as public housing, again, you don't want vouchers for that. You want to use your CAP fund, or you want to get an emergency CAP fund grant. You do not want the tenant protection vouchers for those circumstances. But if you're sure that the building is a complete and total loss and all you're interested in is getting some vouchers, then what you need to do, first of all, is to go ahead and upload into PIC some threshold requirements that show that, one, the building has been destroyed, and there's an imminent health and safety issue for residents. So whatever you need to do to show the obsolescence of the property, and we'll take photographs, we can take insurance claims, any kind of third-party reports, if there's been a fire, if there's a fire claim or something like that. Whatever you have, upload that into PIC so we can see that, and submit and identify exactly which units are coming out. You can go back later and finish your ER plan, your environmental review. You can do your PHA plan. You can do your resident consultations all later. That part doesn't need to come in, but we do need to have some proof that an auditor can go in and look and say, yeah, that building's destroyed, it's okay. We're going to go ahead and issue those emergency TPVs now. Once that's been submitted, the reviewers within the SAC will review what is submitted and make sure they agree, at which point we will notify the voucher office that we agree that this is now, we need to get the emergency TPVs into the hands of the housing authority. I do think that you need to submit an emergency TPV application through your field office as well. And once the voucher office has that and SAC has agreed to it, it usually takes 2 to 3 weeks, and they can issue the vouchers immediately and get them into your hands so that you can get residents rehoused elsewhere. Just for those housing authorities that do not have a voucher program, and so they couldn't receive emergency TPVs, we can award those TPVs to a PHA with an HCV program that's in the nearby jurisdiction or that you would prefer to partner with. We'll work with the field office to identify a nearby HCV program that can issue those vouchers for you. and lend them to you. So we would try to get you the vouchers quickly as we can. All right, next slide. Okay, so when you apply, the difference in applying for the emergency TPVs than regular TPVs is you still work with your local field office. For the emergency TPVs, you do have to submit the HUD 52515 TPV application to the local field office. HUD FMD will work with the field office to expedite the TPV request, and as I said earlier, the typical turnaround is somewhere between 5 and 10 business days. If you want to get regular TPVs and you're going to apply for Section 18 and let's say your application's already in, you may just want to wait, and we would just notify us and we'll see what we can do to expedite that application. Once you have the HUD approval, then you can you do not need to provide a 90-day notice. You can go ahead and immediately relocate those families. If the families are temporarily housed, you can offer the TPVs as permanent housing. So this is all in 2214, the HUD funding notice. Okay, next slide. So, I mean, the main thing we wanted to talk about today is the difference between TPVs versus CAP funds. Again, with the emergency TPVs, the field office needs to concur that there's an imminent health and safety to the families, that the property will meet the Section 18 obsolescence test. Either that or there's a real health and safety issue that is documented and is going to be too expensive to fix. You've made the firm decision to reposition under Section 18, and you do know further plans. You can submit a Section 18 application even if it's complete. As for the emergency CAP funds, it should be an emergency or non-presidentially declared natural disaster. And there again, you would work to get a grant that would help either bring the building back or relocate residents on a temporary basis or whatever, however you want to use it. It's available to do that. One more final thing of note, last slide, is that for PIC, Kayla, you want to turn the slide thing? Yeah. You can request that your field office put vacant units into natural disaster, casualty loss, or undergoing modernization subcategory in PIC during the period between the date a unit becomes uninhabitable until the unit is either rehabbed or approved for demolition or disposition. So for up to 3 years. But just be somewhat thoughtful about how that works. So hoping that makes some sense. Okay, and finally we have various resources available to you as you see fit. So we're in time for questions, and Chris Granger has now joined us, so that's good news. So are there questions?
Yes, let me just move Chris up to panelist. I see him down in the attendee. There we go.
Okay.
So we had one question come in during the presentation. But just want to, before we dive into that, just want to remind folks who maybe joined a little bit late how we're going to do questions. So there's two ways. You can either raise your hand using the hand-shaped icon in the right-hand navigation panel, like so. You can see I have a little hand-shaped icon next to my name. And if I see that, I will unmute your line so you can ask your question verbally. That's typically pretty helpful if you have sort of a longer question that needs some context and explanation. And there, you know, if you ask us a question in the chat and we think it needs a little bit more detail, we'll ask if we can unmute your line. That being said, the second way that you can ask a question is to just simply put it in the chat box, and I will read them out loud to our panelists and get them answered in the order that they are received. So looking through everyone now, it doesn't look. So I'm going to ask, we have one person with their hand raised, and then we got one question that came in during the presentation. So I'm going to start with the question that came in during the presentation, since that one was first. This came in during Tony's portion, and it looks like he had to jump off with a conflict. So I'm just going to ask this to the general panelist group. How do you designate a unit a natural disaster if you shouldn't EOP a tenant? Any thoughts on that from the panelists? And Chris, I know you're just joining, so if you could just go on mute until you want to respond. Thank you.
I think, this is Kathy, I'll think others can chime in. I think you can still work with your field office to designate the unit as vacant under an approved PIC category due to a natural disaster, but not permanently remove the families from the public housing program through EOP unless they are in fact permanently relocated. So, you know, I think Tony talked about FEMA assistance and other possible temporary assistance. So while those families are being temporarily assisted in other housing, they're still a part of the public housing program, whether they're in FEMA units or hotels or something like that. Only as you kind of figure out if you're going to restore the housing and all the points covered by the presentation, those families, again, are still public housing until you've made a permanent decision to remove the units and the families from public housing. So I hope that helps. Others can chime in.
Yes, and I agree with Kathy. You know, your first reference, as we've been saying, is your field office, and you know, right in the resources is PIH Notice 2022-03, which talks about unit designation. So just make sure that you have those conversations with your field office and get the appropriate guidance on which of the categories would apply to specific cases.
Okay, great. So let me go down and unmute. The Housing Authority of the City of Annapolis has their hand raised for a question, so I'm going to unmute you now so you can ask that question. Annapolis, are you there?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I had a question. If you have a property that is already converted to RAD, through RAD, and has PBVs, or is a RAD/Section 18 blended property, and a natural disaster or some type of disaster occurs, and you need to relocate families, which one of these options are best suited for those types of properties?
So if the property has already been removed from public housing and is under a RAD use agreement in a PVV or other HAP contract, and that property is impacted by a natural disaster, is that the scenario you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay, so those would be, of course, you know, some of this slide deck still applies, like, you know, protecting the residents first and ensuring their safety, but the actual requirements and resources available to you. FEMA still might be available, and there might be certain resources discussed in this presentation that could be applicable, but really you're working under a different set of parameters, and that is the RAD use agreement and the TPV. Others might have other thoughts.
Yeah, so if I may add, so the individual assistance programs for the families of the FEMA individual assistance programs, although all of us impacted by disaster under presidentially declared disaster, major disaster declaration, are eligible for all the individual assistance programs that would be available on a specific jurisdiction. So all the relocation options that are provided during this presentation that are provided by FEMA, those individuals that live in those units will be eligible for all those temporary FEMA sheltering options. With regard to the part on the reconstruction, it would Jane mentioned that FEMA may be available depending on the type of ownership structure. If the PHA is part of the ownership structure, it could be eligible. But then again, you'll need to have those conversations with the you know, the regulatory and operating agreement and so on, right? And then, you know, your insurance will be the first line of funding available for reconstruction purposes. So that's my take to that question.
So just to clarify, a tenant living in a project-based unit would not be eligible for an emergency voucher, as described here.
Yeah, that's correct, because that family is no longer public housing. So, you know, I think there's a way to do it if you give that family a preference in your Section 8 admin plan to say, you know, families in certain projects will get a preference for our Section 8 HCV waiting list over our Section 8A waiting list in certain instances. So you could probably build in a preference, but that would come from your existing HCV and not a new allocation of tenant protection vouchers from HUD.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question. So if we are repositioning and need to place vacant units in undergoing modernization subcategory in PIC, do we need to have HUD's approval prior to placing the units in the category undergoing modernization subcategory in PIC?
I can answer this one, and the answer is yes. So in going back to our latest notice for all unit subcategories, the very first step to place a unit in any subcategory other than occupied by assisted tenant or vacant, it requires HUD approval. Another important aspect as well is that the PHA should submit that request within 30 days of the proposed effective date of that unit.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Not seeing any other questions. Give folks a few more minutes to get their thoughts into the chat or to raise their hand. Okay, yeah, looks like Brian sent. Oh, thanks, go ahead.
I just put a link to the notice I was referring to, which is PH Notice 2021-35, which includes all the specific unit subcategories. In addition, for this conversation, the natural disaster subcategory may also be of interest, so take a careful look at that one as well to look at the requirements associated with that. And one of the pitfalls that we have seen recently with individuals applying for natural disaster is that they've tried to put units into natural disaster several months after the actual event occurred, and they are still subject to be put into the subcategory within the appropriate designated times. So make sure if you have been impacted by a disaster that you are appropriately transitioning those over to natural disaster in the ample time frames. Not only will you receive some additional operating subsidy for that and a financial incentive, but also if you have a REAC inspection that is forthcoming, those units will be removed out of your sample inspection, so that way you will not be penalized for the damages of that storm.
Thank you. So still not seeing any questions. Do a last call. Give folks a minute. While we're waiting, just wanted to say that the presentation was sent around to everyone who was registered by 9 a.m. this morning. I will send it around again following this session, likely tomorrow morning once the attendance list loads in the system. So this presentation will be sent around and available to everyone. It will also be posted on HUD Exchange, like I mentioned, so you'll have access to it there as well. Okay, so I'm not seeing any more questions. Jane, I'll pass it to you for any closing remarks or any wrap-up things you want to touch on.
I want to thank everybody for coming in today. I know we are actually at the very beginning of the hurricane season, and we've seen some tornadoes and fires, and the fires are going pretty strong right now. So I appreciate everybody tuning into this and being part of this, and I especially want to thank our panelists for stepping up and being part of this as well. So Brian, Christopher, Antonio, Tony, Kathy, thank you guys for jumping on, and Kayla for running a great show. Thank you all. And we will see you guys hopefully in the near future.
Yes, thanks everyone. And don't forget to fill out the survey. Have a great day.
Thank you.